Good evening. Welcome to the Voices for Nature podcast. My name's Chris Gambian.
And I'm Jackie Mumford.
And Jackie Mumford, you have a new title.
I do. I am now the Deputy Chief Executive of the Nature Conservation Council, which I'm very, very lucky to be able to take on that title.
And Jackie's first act as Deputy Chief Executive has been to provide the staff with cake in the staff meeting. So
it's not a form of bribery, I swear. I just think it's a nice idea.
Yeah, you can please some of the people some of the time, let me assure you.
I'm sure I've got all of that to look forward to.
Big episode tonight. We've got a great conversation with Xavier Martin from the Farmers Federation.
And Phil Spark, who's an ecologist and also a farmer.
Yeah, and a Life Achievement Award winner from NCC.
Yeah, that's right. He's been quite active in the environmental space for a long time and has been an amazing advocate for nature in New South Wales.
Great chat about the mouse plague that is affecting really huge parts of New South Wales right at the moment.
Yeah, that's right, yep.
Impacting farms, ecosystems, the whole lot.
Yeah, and people will have heard about the mouse plague in the news, I'm sure. Some of the impacts that we're hearing about recently are galahs, people talking about galahs falling out of the sky, falling out of trees, and some of the sort of flow-on impacts that the plague is having on the natural environment. And so it'll be really great to talk to our guests about sort of some of the control methods that are being used to try and get the mouse plague under control. And I think there's a bit of confusion out there and some misinformation about the different poisons that are being used and how the whole thing is being managed.
Yeah.
I think a big one to really dig into is the use of this bromadiolone, which is something that is not actually been approved for use yet at any large scale. It's the kind of household poison that is currently available in supermarkets. And zinc phosphate, which is the other sort of form of control, which is being more widely used. But what the big problem is when these things are being used against the guidelines. People think that doubling doses is necessary to sort of be more effective as a control method, which is where we're starting to see problems in the landscape when that's not actually necessary.
Yeah.
And no one, as we'll, I'm sure that when we speak to our guests tonight, the farmers are not necessarily pushing for that. So it'll be interesting to talk to them.
Yeah, World Environment Day last Saturday. How did you spend it?
Well, the only way you could spend World Environment Day. We had a rally down in Hyde Park for koalas, really trying to show the New South Wales government that we haven't lifted the pressure as much as the sort of story of the koalas and the plight of the koalas hasn't been in the news as much as it was at the start of the year or the end of last year. We're still really concerned about what's happening with koalas and the changes in the planning system to how their habitat is managed. So we had a rally in Hyde Park, and I was very glad to be joined by hundreds of other Sydney-siders for World Environment Day and some wonderful speakers to sort of hear about what's going on with koalas.
It was an absolutely fantastic event, but one of the things I said in my speech at the rally, which I'll say again, is we really should be trying to make World Environment Day a big event on the calendar across New South Wales, and next year will be the 50th anniversary of World Environment Day. So let's try to get a huge turnout. Let's try to get a massive rally in Sydney a year from now. It'll take a lot of effort, but let's get a big cross-section of the community turn out, because everybody loves nature.
Yeah,
this is not a niche issue, is it?
No, it's really not. And World Environment Day is a great opportunity to acknowledge that and to celebrate our environment and to speak up for the issues that it faces.
Some damning news for the federal government this week about some of their dam plans. Yeah,
that's right. Dams don't make it rain.
They sure don't. So Professor Mark Howden from ANU and from IPCC says that the modelling for the Far West is far worse than anybody predicted, or the outcome from the modelling.
That's right. Like a lot of things, climate change is actually going to be much worse than predicted for flows in the western part of New South Wales.
39% less water in the system. What are you building a dam for? You're really, throwing good money after bad.
Yeah, that's right. Especially, if we aren't addressing the real cause of the problem, which is climate change, and some of the things that we've talked about in the podcast in the past, like harvesting water, using floodplain harvesting, not letting it actually flow down the system, which is what we really need to do.
We just can't have business as usual, can we? Like the rules that might have applied in the past cannot continue to apply. The circumstances have changed. It's changing for everybody. That doesn't mean it's a good thing. It's just a thing that is a real thing that we've got to deal with.
And I saw you driving in an electric vehicle across the Harbour Bridge this week, Chris.
Tell you what, I could get used to it. I drove a Tesla Model 3, which is a very, very comfortable ride, let me tell you.
And timely, because the New South Wales government are currently considering whether they offer incentives to have more EVs in New South Wales.
Yeah, that's right. There's a choice right now. We've got the state budget coming up in a few weeks' time. The government could either incentivise them, and all the benefits we get from that, we get the better models from overseas, that will be cheaper models, we get more people able to afford the cars themselves. Or we can go straight to the sort of short-term revenue option, which is tax the ones that are around and probably kill off the industry for a few more years yet. And
then we won't get all those great environmental benefits that we heard about when we spoke to Bayard last week from the EV Council. Yeah.
We launched a campaign this week and made a little video, so let's check it out. So there's no exhaust pipe, which means there's no carbon emissions and there's no air pollution. It's also incredibly quiet, but it still has unbelievable acceleration. Transport is the biggest cause of global warming after coal power. It's over 20% of New South Wales climate emissions. So we need to clean it up, and we can do that with electric cars. Overseas, they're trying to incentivise electric vehicles through the tax system. In the US, you can get $7,500. In the UK, £2,500. In Germany, €6,000. And in China, the equivalent of 10,000 Australian dollars. And it's worked. In Norway last month, 4 out of 5 new car sales were plug-ins. Imagine that. But in Australia, there are virtually no incentives. And that's why we're way behind. Less than 1 in 100 new cars sold here is electric. Because of the lack of incentives, a lot of models aren't even making their way to Australia. Some of them are increasingly affordable. So incentives would make a huge difference to the take-up of EVs in Australia. The New South Wales government could waive stamp duty, give registration discounts, provide direct incentives for buying electric cars, make 100% of government fleet car purchases electric, and set a target for EV sales. To hit our Paris goals, 75% of new cars need to be zero emissions by 2030. Look, I grew up in suburban Sydney where cars is how you get around. My dad's a motor mechanic, cars have been part of my whole life, and I love to drive, and these cars are absolutely fantastic. They cut emissions, they cut air pollution, they're really quiet, they improve the overall urban environment, they're really a win-win all around. We've got to be incentivising these cars, we've got to make them more affordable, and to put a tax on them right now would be absolutely madness. So sign the petition, get involved in the campaign so we can make EVs much more affordable in New South Wales.
And to talk about the mouse plague, we're now joined by Xavier Martin and Phil Spark. Xavier Martin is the Vice President of the New South Wales Farmers and a farmer, and Phil Spark is an ecologist and a farmer, and a recipient of the Nature Conservation Council Dunphy Award. Thanks for both joining us tonight. It'd be great just to hear, for us here in the city, we see news reports, we see some pictures and footage of the mouse plague, but maybe you can just paint a bit of a picture for us. What's it like out on your farms, and maybe starting with you, Phil, up there in Tamworth, where you're calling in from?
Yeah, right. Well, certainly this last 6 months has been a real eye-opener for me. I've been doing a lot of surveys, wildlife surveys in our region nearby, and I've also been doing a lot of wildlife surveys over on the eastern Fall Country in the national parks, where there's been the extreme bushfires. And it's been very alarming, the abundance of mice that we've been seeing virtually everywhere. And it's unprecedented. So I've been doing this sort of work myself since about 2000, and we've never seen an abundance of mice in natural habitats before. So this is really unique. And discussing with other researchers that do a lot of the similar work that I do, I've not spoken to anyone who's heard of this occurrence before. So yeah, it does seem to be really unique, and there's widespread. There's been a big decline of native small mammals, and there's this huge increase of feral mice, and not just feral mice, but also the rats as well. Rats are probably more of a problem on the western slopes. So the edges of the tablelands running north-south from sort of Murrurundi up to the Queensland border. We've been finding a lot of rats as well, but not so much on the tablelands. But yeah, catching mice in elliot traps, pitfall traps, And it's been really alarming, the abundance of them.
And what about you, Xavier? What are you seeing at your place?
Well, look, our observations are that about this time last year, when we were planting some canola, it was apparent that there was a higher level than the normal background level of mice, and to some extent, as Phil said, with rats. So we started precautionary baiting back then. So we've been baiting for more than 12 months on our farms. I've seen quite a few hotspots within our boundaries. You know, some areas have a major infestation as equal to what I've seen. Probably the worst I've seen was 1984, but I've been active in the grain belt since the late 70s. I used to do quite a bit of harvesting from southern Queensland down into Victoria. So I've got a reasonable awareness of the different plagues. And whilst this one's patchy, you know, there's some places where you think they're exploding and then next thing they're dying out as they run out of food and start cannibalising each other. But in other places where they found a new food source or they adapt to a new food source, they just explode again and they look like they're training for Tokyo. You know, they're rushing around. I have noticed the holes on our farm in the mung bean crop that's just been harvested. They've done an excellent job of scavenging the late pods and seeds and stacking them around their holes, all ready to survive the winter, and obviously got a plan for spring.
Yeah, right. And you know, you mentioned how this is unprecedented, Phil, and you compared it to 1984, Xavier. Why is it so bad now? What's led to these sort of conditions?
In natural habitats, so this is outside of agricultural areas. In natural habitats, it's been the drought and the and areas where there's been bad fires. It's been both drought and fire that's decimated our small mammal populations, and it's left a vacant niche that you know, normally our small mammals would help to control mice abundance, and their populations decline to an extent that mice have been able to breed without any pressure on them. So I think that's what's happening in the natural environment, and it's probably an indicator of, you know, of climate change, basically. So, like I was saying before, where you've got these you know, tall forests that run up and down the eastern fall country, even rainforest. I've been trapping mice in rainforest, which is bizarre. And it would seem that, you know, the warmer temperatures that we're getting now just seems to favour their survival, and without the numbers of small mammals that normally prey on them, yeah, they've just increased, and it's happened virtually everywhere. Like I also do some work out at on the plains, Liverpool Plains, near Xavier's place, where I'm monitoring rare grasses in travelling stock routes, and I'm seeing the same thing out there, where the mice are actually harvesting the seed of the rare grass that I'm trying to, you know, to monitor. And like Xavier said with the mung beans, you know, they're collecting that seed and stashing it with everything else. So yeah, look, it's really interesting, and the fact that it's having such a widespread impact in natural environments, to me, is reason and justification that we need to be looking a lot further than just bait control. What we need to be looking at is genetic control, something that's more widespread, usable right across the landscape, rather than, you know, sort of hit and miss approach with baits in limited areas.
Xavier, those of us who live in the city, we've seen the news footage of the mice kind of in large numbers running around, and but paint a picture for us. If you're a farmer in sort of Western New South Wales at the moment, what does this mean? What is the kind of impact on a farm and a farmer from the plague? Yeah,
so what the impact is multiple. For a start, you know, wake up in the morning and you find that you got mouse urine on your pillow or feces on your pillow. You know, perhaps you've been bitten in bed. You know, you discover that you know, they're all over your kitchen bench, they're in your cupboards, they're in your clothes. You go to put your boots on, they're in your boots. You know, so you start of your day, it's quite obvious that there's a plague. It's not just a problem, as Minister Marshall was trying to call it, it's a plague. And so you step out the back door and you think about, you know, farmers make a living out of healthy plants and healthy animals. So you're obviously thinking, well, how are they faring today and what's happening? And, you know, Phil's just touched on the issues around the mice scavenging off native grasses and pastures as well as domesticated ones. So, you know, there's been a bit of a focus on the food crops and even, you know, to some extent on fibre, on cotton, because after the seed in the lint, and they don't mind the lint either, take down their hole and keep warm. Yeah. So then the farmer gets to, in thinking about caring for the, you know, being a good steward of that landscape for the day, they then think, oh, I'll jump in the ute or I'll go and get the tractor, and it doesn't start. And they go, well, how could that be? And of course, then you might smell some electrical wiring or something, and you go, well, what's going on? Or, you know, the mouse or the rat, mainly mice at the moment, is eating through the electrical system or the control system. And, you know, we've had members who've had equipment burnt to the ground, houses have been burnt. There's a lot of damage out there at the moment. Just in our house, they ate through the drain hose on the dishwasher and it flooded the kitchen and just ruined all the kitchen cupboards and everything. So, you know, these sorts of things, by the end of the day, the farmer can feel like, yes, I keep putting my hand in my pocket trying to control this plague, and, you know, how much longer can I keep doing this? And in terms of recovering from the drought, and I hear what Phil said about the issues around predators and, you know, perhaps mice just breeding a lot faster than predators can get back to work after the drought. They took a massive hit. Both the ferals, you know, there was fox carcasses around, they ran out of food and died in the paddock. Unfortunately, wild pigs didn't quite die in the paddock like that, but and the natives, you know, the egrets, the barn owls and things like that, clearly faded in their populations through the drought. And they just don't breed up again as fast as mice do. Mice with their 10 pups every 20 days takes a bit of catching. And so that's why we've got to respond to this plague.
And the predators that you mentioned, and, you know, Phil, you were talking about the sort of wildlife service that you do as well. What are some of the impacts that you're seeing now on those predators?
Well, I can't say that I've been involved in any broad-scale baiting programs to have observed those sort of impacts. I can only listen to what vets and wires carers are telling us all and reporting. So they're saying that certainly around urban areas, there's a lot of problems associated with pets getting baits and also native wildlife eating mice and rats that have been poisoned. So yeah, within that landscape, the urban landscape, there's certainly lots of evidence. As far as what's happening out broad scale, I'm not personally aware of what that is. I've listened to Steve Henry's explanation of what he's observed, and according to those experts, there's not a lot of deaths associated with this zinc phosphide. If the bromaldolone were to become eligible, legalised for use in broad scale situations, that would be a very different picture. But yeah, so that's basically where I'm coming from.
Xavier, what sort of things have farmers been doing to date? You were telling me earlier about the baiting that you've been doing on your property. Tell us a bit more about the sort of things that farmers might do as a instinctive response or as a sort of routine response, and how does that compare to what is going to be needed in terms of the scale of the problem?
So what farmers do on a daily basis is they've got an awareness. Most farmers have a budget line item of a 3 or 4 figure sum to do feral and vermin management. So they're aware of you know, various techniques they might employ. Some as simple as perhaps slashing the sides of fields, you know, to allow you know, hawks and owls and other predators, you know, to be able to observe movement. So there may be simple methods like that, or they may be more elaborate methods where they've measured the population increase via bait cards and, you know, correlated that over time and said, well, look, you know, I've got a an event underway here. It's on the edge of being a plague and a financial, an significant economic impact. So that's when they'll take more elaborate action potentially with zinc phosphide, and typically in crop via aerial application, and perhaps in some situations via ground application. So all that involves considerable cost, and instead of that 3 or 4 figure budget line item that a farmer might have, all of a sudden they find themselves with a 5 figure or even a 6 figure sum. And of course you've got a lot of free riders. It's a bit like trying to manage COVID on a cruise ship. You might have some clean rooms, but there's other people spreading it from room to room. It's the same with mice. They don't all line up at the boundary and ask permission to come in. So they're charging about all over the place. And so even though one landholder might be a good steward of that part of the landscape, cross-infestation occurs very readily.
So the management at the moment of the plague is really just coming down to individual farmers. Has there been any kind of sort of concerted government response?
Well, the only response we've seen, and we've welcomed it, is that the New South Wales government has acknowledged that this is a plague, not just a problem. We've been talking to them for many months and telling them this, but they've let it turn into a plague, really. And of course that's spread, the hotspots have spread into Queensland and into north-western Victoria. So where we're at now is, it's still a pretty patchwork approach across New South Wales, although the 150 million plus funding that's been put on the table for various streams of response from government is likely to improve the efficiency and the method of control. However, I think it's important to learn from the approach that takes place in Western Australia, where there seems to be a lot more cooperation and collaboration across the landscape, and they only need to bait very occasionally and potentially only once per year just to keep the threshold levels manageable. And so I'm impressed with that, where some of my peers over there seem to be able to get 3,000 to 5,000 square kilometres together to deal with. Whereas here, we'd be lucky to get 300 to 500 hectares together, only a couple of square kilometres together to deal with in one area.
When we're talking about sort of the scale here, you were saying to me earlier that how many baits have you put out?
Yeah, so across our multiple baitings of our whole farms, we've multiplied that out by the number of baits per kilo, which is essentially a wheat seed with 25 milligrams of zinc phosphide on it, coated on with a bit of canola oil, just to, to make it appetising as a bait for the rodent. And we put over 1 billion out on our farm over the last 12 months, and they've all been taken. So presumably that's about how many mice we've controlled.
That's just on your one property.
Yeah, and we're not
say
large.
Nothing of your neighbours.
Yeah, we're just moderate-sized farmers, and so no, it's an extraordinary problem.
So what's it going to take now that this has happened and we're sort of in the middle of it? Clearly, it's a crisis. What's the sort of wholesale sort of intervention that would be useful at this point?
So, barring some biological breakthrough, like has been referred to, or mice catching their version of the flu or the COVID, unless there's a natural sequence that causes a decline, causes a peak in their plague, the reality is that to have the food and fibre we want to produce in New South Wales to keep the economy going, to feed and clothe people, we are going to have a reasonable strategy over the coming months before spring, because they're clearly bunkering down for the winter at the moment. I've referred to the fact that they've got food stacked in their pantry, and once they decide that it's time once they decide there's food available in different species, like canolas, like a protein shot for them. So as soon as pods start forming on canola, as soon as those yellow flowers start to drop, you can be sure that if there's a background mouse level at that point, they will take that crop.
And in like that kind of strategy that you're talking about, like having a broad scale approach and being mindful that spring is when they're going to really boom, what sort of things would you like to see in that approach? And Phil, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, as sort of from an ecology perspective, to make sure that we are having the least impact that we can on sort of natural systems.
Yeah, well, presently the registration for the use of zinc phosphide is for fallow applications in crop. So that's a small part of the whole landscape that is actually, mice are being controlled. There's a lot of landscape interconnecting all that area that is still going to have a lot of mice in it. And I was listening to Steve Henry's presentation. He was saying that it's quite ineffective to try and bait in natural areas too, because of the moisture retained in the litter of pasture causes the bait to go off quickly. So yeah, we're only talking about a small portion that's actually being controlled or possibly being controlled. Which sort of brings me back to this thing that we really need to be looking at bigger picture solutions that are going to work outside of these cultivation scenarios, where genetics and that sort of thing that'll address because I think this is a sign of the times, a sign of the future. I think with global warming, I think pests like mice, the problem could get worse and worse, and we need to be looking at what will work on a bigger scale.
From a farmer's point of view, they will look at all practical methods. Like even now, as we speak, there are farmers taking precautions with haystacks, with their sheds, with their equipment, with how they plant their crops, the type of crops they plant. There's certainly been a move away from canola, even though it's a very high value crop. It's just not a readily manageable risk. And farmers only make a living out of good science. So they want tools that are useful. They're seeing zinc phosphide as one of the most useful tools in terms of a broadacre scale tool. And they're very mindful of what's going on around their house and sheds and of domesticated animals, and anything that scavengers like the farm dog, pigs, poultry, they don't want to see them sick. And they don't make money out of sick animals. Sick animals cost them money. And the same with native animals. I've had a lot of members say to me, we had this bromadiolone under permit in 2016 or 2017 and we used it then, and they've got reservations about what they saw. So they've been very concerned that the minister's concept around napalm and the use of it, and look, the good science may show some permit conditions that make it a useful tool, but I'd have to say what my members are saying to me is if it is permitted, it's likely to be a very small tool in the toolbox, not a big tool in the toolbox.
That's probably a good segue into that bigger question. So there's obviously this proposal now to provide an exemption for bromadiolone. What are the pros and cons? Well, first of all, Phil, perhaps you can tell us what is it? What's it meant to do, and what are some of the consequences?
Well, by what I've read, it would seem that it's pretty much banned for broad-scale use in other places of the world, and its main problem is that it's an accumulator, and it builds up and goes right through the food chain, and animals can eat a lot more than what is just a lethal dose. They can keep eating after they've had enough for a lethal dose, and that increases the concentration in the carcass so much more that a predator, bird, whatever that eats it will be so much more effective. And the other thing with it, it has a long life in the field, so it doesn't break down anything like as quick as the zinc phosphide. So they're the big issues, and it's pretty widely recognised that it's a nasty chemical, and its non-target impacts are really too great. And I'm surprised that it's really being put up as a possible solution in this case.
But Phil, you'd have to admit that it is down at the supermarket right now available for householders to put in their roof cavities and in their walls. So even though I respect what you're saying about it being potentially nasty, and I'm no great fan of the second generation anticoagulants. I think they've been fraught in some of their global experience, but it does have a use, does have a purpose. In relation to ag though, there's a big question mark over what the permitted uses might be. And I concur with your point about, you know, one's a pineapple and one's a strawberry, really. It's just they're not even on the same page. I mean, zinc phosphide kills within an hour. I mean, my observation's more like a minute, and converts into phosphine gas in the gut in less than 24 hours. So it's a harmless secondary toxicity effect. I haven't seen any evidence of secondary toxicity at all. But when you go to the BDs, what are we talking, a week to kill? And then secondary toxicity 100 to 200 days. So, you know, I mean, it's just not even close.
So the reason that it's being put forward is that the application, like is it faster application, or what's the sort of...
Well, completely different modes of action, and then completely different LD50, you know, the accumulation that Phil referred to.
What's an accumulator?
Well, it's one that doesn't break down in the organism, in this case, species mouse, moose, or whatever you pronounce it in Latin. And yeah, so you know, it accumulates instead of the phosphide just converting into a gas and fuming off. Yep. So once it accumulates, it eventually has that effect of not allowing the vascular system to clot in the rat or the mouse, in the rodent, and so they bleed to death. And so it's, you know, instead of being a very quick death like zinc phosphide, it's really not a quick death. Yep. And that's why people hear the mice or rats in their ceiling or in their walls for some time, some days after they've taken a bait, because it does take time. I mean, the good thing about being in the ceiling and walls is you don't have domesticated animals or native animals getting access, or almost certainly they won't get access to the secondary toxicity of the carcass, which is, our members are saying to me, is their significant concern, is how do you manage a toxic carcass for 100 to 200 days and you don't even know it's there. Like, your dog will sniff it out, or your poultry will go and find it, but you mightn't even know it's there.
Right, and there's sort of principles that say even in our backyard situation, you wouldn't leave these baits out in your yard, you know, lest a mouse eats it, runs down to the local park, an owl eats the mouse, the owl dies because of your bait, or your dog, or your neighbour's dog, or cat, or whatever.
Yeah, and look, to the extent that a rodent in your roof is probably making their home out of your insulation, you know, so they're not probably going to go back down to your yard. That's where they've made their home, in your roof. They're probably, you know, digesting some of your electrical wiring, or you're lagging off your plumbing. You know, that's probably what they're living off. They might have some other food sources, but you put in a bit of wax block with BD in it, and they go, oh, this is pretty good, you know. And so, as Phil said, they'll keep coming back and guts themselves, but they still don't die in a minute or an hour.
So what's the advantage? Why BD?
Oh, it's a different mode of action, and
explain that. What do you mean by mode of action?
Well, look, there's risks around zinc phosphide. Zinc phosphide killed a lot of good men during the wars. You know, that was a common weapon of war. Was you know, that was a very effective weapon against infantrymen, you know, troopers, and so, you know, you don't put it in your house. Phil referred earlier to it being around moisture in pasture. You know, as soon as you put it near moisture, a day like today, if you had a saucer of it out there, it immediately it fumes off, and we'd be going, whoa, where'd that come from? Yeah, so it's not suitable for use in household or commercial premises, but it lends itself to use in broad-scale landscape. So, you know, as I said, I think I called it a pineapple and a strawberry. They're just extremely different things.
Yep. So I still don't quite understand what, in a pastoral setting, why BD? Why is it?
Right, so under permit...
Why would Adam Marshall propose this, I guess, is the question I'm asking.
And look, you'd have to ask Minister Marshall on what advice he thought this was a reasonable matter, that to ask for a permit or 2 permits off the APVMA. But what our members say in relation to their experience when it was under permit in 16 and 17 is that it was a useful tool under that permit if you adhered to the perimeter baiting. You're not allowed to perimeter around your haystacks or sheds or anything. It was on fences, I stand corrected, but I think there was some use of the bait. It's a wheat seed with the coating on it, with the BD coating on it, inside a pipe, so that only mice and rats could get in at it. So you didn't have your wedge-tailed eagle or your barn owl getting in at it. So, if you adhered to that, it was a useful tool, but a small tool, but you still had to be extremely wary that the problem being that the mouse came out of there and took a week to die so they could migrate around a lot, and then had this 100 to 200 days secondary effect. So look, I've heard the stories of people losing their farm dog and, noticing other predators impacted by it. And, the scavenging going on our farms right now, the other day I was sowing durum wheat, and I roughly was able to check for around that 50 to 70 crows following me around. So they were pretty happy. In fact, they're that fat they can hardly fly. And then they scattered all of a sudden. I wondered why. And one of the breeding pairs of wedge-tails came in, and they cleaned up what they wanted to quite quickly. And so there's a range of native and exotic predators that are out there in the landscape right now. And managing those with low impact is really, really important to farmers.
There's been some research done into wedge-tailed eagles and owls, looking at concentrations of bromelain going, over time going through the food chain, and it's very real, and it can go a long way from where it was actually applied. So it doesn't stay within the paddock where it's put. It can go up the food chain and disperse over very long distances. So. Yeah, and the fact that those animals wander around half drunk, it really makes them a big target for all the kestrels by day and the hawks and by night the owls and so it's sort of it's a really strong lure for them as well, to encourage them to take them more so than if something's dead laying on the ground, they're far less likely to actually pick it up and eat it. It's the movement that attracts most predators' attention, and to have them laced with that strong bait too. That's the real double whammy.
Thanks both for coming on the show. Xavier, you're Vice President of New South Wales Farmers. If people want to support farmers through this, what's the practical thing those of us who live in the cities or the East Coast can do?
I think the most important thing that any citizen can do is communicate with their MPs and say to them, look, this is a shared responsibility to manage this. None of us as individuals can cope with these sorts of plague events, this sort of scale we're seeing as lone rangers. We do need to all work together. We shouldn't have patients being bitten in hospital. We shouldn't have mammalian diseases being spread from rodents to human beings. And that's what's happening right now out there. And so that's why it's really important. We welcome the government's belated response. It would have been way better months ago. A lot of consulting, a lot of talking and very poor actions has caused that delay. But we welcome that they have at this stage got to the point of saying, well, there are the resources on the table, $150 odd million. There is a simple process for householders to claim back 100% rebate at Service New South Wales, for commercial premises owners to claim back. There is some process underway for a 50% claim back for farmers up to a limit that's lower than what we were hoping for, but it's a good start. It's a down payment on trying to manage the plague. It's not as simple as Service New South Wales to engage with RAA, which is a bit unfortunate, but we'll wait and see how that unfolds.
Great. Xavier, Phil, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It sounds horrifying to see that many mice in the landscape.
Yeah, it's really helpful to actually get that picture of what life is like. What Xavier was saying about waking up in the morning and there's a mouse in your bed.
On your pillow.
Yeah, mice in your boots. Like, it's kind of, I've seen some videos and some footage, but it's kind of hard to fathom that people are actually living their lives like this. With just the kind of scope of it. It's just crazy.
The numbers. We had a mouse in our house, and that was bad enough. He's talking about 1 billion mice on just one farm.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to comprehend.
One of the things that I think a number of people are saying is, mice are animals too, and we need to make sure that we're not sort of being unreasonably cruel. But the impact on the ecosystem from what is effectively, well, it's a feral pest, is enormous, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, and that's why, we were so interested to talk to Phil, who's an ecologist, but also, Xavier, because I think there is actually quite a bit of overlap in how ecologists and farmers want to manage this. Nobody wants mice out there doing the damage they're doing, because as much as they are damaging farms, they're also damaging all of our beautiful natural places. That they're destroying the habitats of native birds and wildlife. They're eating eggs, they're creating competition for resources. They just they destroy everything in their path.
And it's the case, isn't it, for when you completely destroy biodiversity on the landscape, this is what happens. You don't have those natural systems there to be natural pest control, natural to keep things in balance. This is not a balanced ecosystem at the moment. You can't have literally probably trillions of mice in the landscape and have that be that's not a balanced ecosystem. That's not
No,
working.
it's not something that our landscape can sustain for any period of time. And we also heard about the sort of systems in place that led to this. Drought, bushfire, all those things that, are huge ecological problems that we have to manage, are also leading to these kind of crises as well. And then, of course, like everything, being worsened by climate change. So it's a huge environmental issue.
It's wonderful, I think, for us to have a representative from the farmers here, because we don't always see eye to eye on everything, and the things that we can work together on, I think we should. I think this is a good example. I think water is another good example. Coal seam gas. There are issues where farmers and conservationists are a unity ticket, and we should explore that and have a constructive relationship. Don't have to agree on everything, but we can come together when our interests and our values align.
Yeah, that's right. And we talk a lot about, at NCC, we talk a lot about building power and working in alliance and how we can be influential in the halls of power. And I think, having some of those unlikely alliances like conservationists and farmers, where historically we might have disagreed on a lot of issues, coming together and, really finding where we do have overlap and where we are calling for the same things, I think will be beneficial for all of us.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Next fortnight, last episode in the season.
Yeah,
so
season final,
big season finale cliffhanger. Just wait, it's going to be incredible.
Tune in, yes.
We've still got a few weeks left in the financial year, so if you can chip in, our tax appeal has gone out, and as we always say, everything that we do is only made possible because of the generous donations that people make, and it's really lovely. Like every week after we do these episodes, people do chip in some money, and it's been wonderful, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, we really do rely on it. And as always, you can go back and listen to this episode as a podcast if you search for Voices for Nature on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And tell your friends. There's lots of people watching, but lots of people who would probably enjoy it but haven't heard about it yet. So if you can spread the word, it helps us get the message about conservation out to people across the state, across the country, and we've even had people write in from around the world to say that they listen. So thanks for listening, and do share the word around.
That's it.